Welcome back, friends. So, the Romantic period, as I was just telling you, we are going to do this, one of the most important periods. Also, the theory of Romanticism, but it's a movement, it's a period, it's an epoch, it's a watershed period in the history of English literature and also in the social history of England. We have English and American Romanticism. I'll be talking about American Romanticism soon when we embark on discussing American literature and its greats. But here, let me talk about Wordsworth and Coleridge, the French Revolution, which served as a background, especially for the English Romanticism, the Lyrical Ballads, publication of the Lyrical Ballads in 1798. Of course, you know the year. Publication of Biographia Literaria, one of the most eminent works of literary criticism by Coleridge, who also gave us the concepts of fancy and imagination. Difficult to understand perhaps at the undergraduate level, but still extremely important and very interesting. They will always come back to you, fancy and imagination in various forms. Poetic diction, that a term that is usually associated with Wordsworth and Coleridge in their lyrical ballads. French Revolution and its emphasis on liberty, equality and fraternity, and that was sort of the inspirational motto for the English romantics as well. We will be talking about Keats, Blake and Shelley also. Uh, so, preface to Lyrical Ballads should be one of the most important documents. Biographia Literaria 1817 is another important document. You should also know someone called William Hazlitt, who wrote his Immortal on poetry in general. The Romantic period in English literature, the period is perhaps 89 to 1832. Okay, but 89 is just where the tremors of the French Revolution were felt. The watershed year or the key year, of course, was 1789, the 1798, the publication of the Lyrical Ballads, and 1832 perhaps this is the period with 1798 to 1832, the peak years of the Romantic period. 1832, why? Because it is the year of Sir Walter Scott's death. Now, the idea of Neoclassicism, the then prevalent ideas of Neoclassicism such as decorum and order were displaced by an emphasis on individual experience. In France, Rousseau famously pointed out, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. So, the emphasis was on individual liberty. There was an emphasis on originality and genius, and this replaced the idea of imitation of classical authors. So, remember, this is one of the key features of the Romantic period. Originality, genius, individualism. The writers of this age were influenced by thinkers such as Locke, Hume and Burke. Wordsworth, one of the most eminent names associated with the English Romantic period, was born in 1770 to 1850. Those are his years. He was impacted by the French Revolution and its ideals of liberty, equality and fraternity. However, he was disillusioned with the turn that the French Revolution had ultimately taken. In 1795, he met Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and together they salvaged the ideals of Romanticism from the anarchy that French Revolution had soon become. So, together they worked on or collaborated on the Lyrical Ballads, collection of 23 intimate poems about rustic life, told in simple language and giving expression to romantic ideals. The idea was to redefine literary taste towards a new language. They shunned the gaudiness and inane phraseology of many modern writers and aim towards, and I am quoting them, an austere purity of language. The emphasis is based on the idea that humble and a rustic life leads to a more permanent and more philosophical language than that which is frequently substituted for it by poets. Wordsworth asserted that there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. Free verse, avoidance of phraseology, elegant turn of phrase, deliberate elegant of phrases. So, the idea was to mark a shift towards natural word order, grammar, sentence structure, etc. in poetry. So, linguistically also it was very important, as distinct from the conventional poetic style of earlier poets, grand, elegant, deliberately classical, imitating the classics. For Wordsworth, a poet is a man is speaking to men. This signifies that the focus is not just on the poet who has a superior intellect, but also on the reader who is understood by the poet as informed and imaginative. So, therefore, you get these words. See, individualism is important. Reader should not be condescending to. Reader is important. Let us not stretch it as far as death of the author, but here the writer is important, but the reader is also important. He is a man with intelligence. This was a literary world where the ordinary people and the misfits also, the non-conformists had a voice. The common people had a significant role to play, where women and children also had a place. So, therefore, imagine so many poems are about the predicament of women and children. This was a poetry of the individual conscience. The idea was no less democratic than the principles behind the French Revolution. Wordsworth and Coleridge gave politics a human face. Coleridge, who was born in 1772, 2 years younger to Wordsworth, and he died in 1834. For him, the distinction between fancy and imagination was very important. This is the major feature of Coleridge's theory of poetry and his general theory of mental processes. In his Biographia Literaria, he asserts that the imagination I consider as primary or secondary. Biographia Literaria, which was published in 1817, as I just told you, he says that no man was ever yet a great poet without being at the same time a profound philosopher. With this, he changed the belief that poetry and philosophy are at loggerheads with each other. They go hand in hand according to Coleridge. His concepts of fancy and imagination, and he famously says, fancy has no other counters to play with but fixities and definites. The fancy is indeed no more than a mode of memory, emancipated from the order of time and space. Fancy is a mechanical process which receives the elementary images, the fixities and definites. However, it is the imagination that produces a much higher kind of poetry and dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. Remember, that's what Coleridge says: dissolve, diffuse, dissipate in order to recreate. While fancy is merely mechanical for Coleridge, imagination is vital. Wordsworth, however, attaches more significance to fancy, and he calls it a creative faculty. In Biographia Literaria, therefore, Coleridge differs from Wordsworth on this and states that what Wordsworth thinks is fancy alone is really fancy and imagination blended, and that poetic genius is shaped by the depth of imagination. For Coleridge, imagination heralded as the ultimate synthesizing faculty, enabling humans to reconcile differences and opposites in a world which is full of appearances. This imagination for Coleridge generates and produces a form of its own, while its rules are the very powers of growth and production. He also talks about synthetic power and says, imagination reveals itself in the balance or reconciliation of opposites or discordant qualities, of sameness with difference, of general with the concrete, the idea with the image. The faculty of imagination assimilates and synthesizes the most disparate elements into an organic whole. The reconciliation of opposites is a central idea for the Romantics. Imagination is inextricably bound up with the other two major concepts, for it is assumed to be the faculty which enables us to read nature as a system of symbols. To Coleridge, the archetype of all geniuses was Shakespeare. He became all things, yet forever remaining himself. For Coleridge, again, the imagination goes beyond, it transcends the experience and creates, and realism did not matter as much as imagination. Kubla Khan, published in 1797, is one of the greatest achievements of these considerations or these theories of poetic imagination. We are often told, and it is an oft repeated story, that Coleridge was under the influence of opium. He fell asleep and had a dream. He dreamt that he was writing a poem, and when he woke up a few hours later, he sat down and penned a few lines. While writing, he was called by someone, and when he came back, he realized that he had forgotten the rest. Still, whatever is a fragmentary dream, we get a poem that is ostensibly grown out of a dream. Here are a few lines from Kubla Khan. Please look at the slide here. That sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair, weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honey dew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise. So that is Kubla Khan, one of the greatest poems ever written. Wordsworth and Coleridge's literary criticism found expression in preface to Lyrical Ballads, and of course Biographia Literaria. They continue to be of central importance in the history of literary criticism. Moving on to William Hazlitt, who lived between 1778 and 1831, a poet, painter, essayist, historian. He was mentored by Coleridge and published an essay on the principles of human action in 1805. He also wrote The Spirit of the Age and the Life of Napoleon in 1830. Hazlitt associated Romantic poetry with the French Revolution. Like Coleridge, Hazlitt had great respect for the imagination, which he knew could change the way we see everyday things. He wrote an essay on genius and common sense and says, you decide from feeling and not from reason. Along the lines of impressionistic critics, he emphasizes on the felt qualities of a work and says, the imagination is the faculty which represents objects, not as they are in themselves, but as they are molded by other thoughts and feelings into an infinite variety of shapes and combinations of powers. In poetry in general, that is 1818, he says poetry is an imitation of nature, but the imagination and the passions are a part of man's nature. Two great ideas or key ideas in Hazlitt's criticism are the issue of style and the idea of sincerity. He says the courage to say as an author, and he stressed upon the courage to say as an author what he felt as man. So, those are the important concepts, categories of the English Romanticism. Remember, romantic literature was highly subjective, saturated with emotional intensity. Idea was, as I have already told you, what Wordsworth and Coleridge, but especially Wordsworth emphasized on that the common man could be the hero. Remember the classics, the Greeks, common man cannot be the hero. Okay? And again, nature was a place of refuge. The Romantics valued nature as opposed to social order. Okay? And a key literary device was the pathetic fallacy, a very favorite device of Wordsworth and Shelley. Also, we have just seen in one of our recent lectures personification. So, pathetic fallacy, nature is not a passive observer, but is sympathetic to people. The Romantics proposed certain realistic techniques such as the use of local color. For example, down to earth characters and Wordsworth's rustics. So, those are the important features of the Romantic poetry. An important critic or a recent critic still alive of the Romantic period, an important author of or observer of the Romantic period is Harold Bloom, an eminent critic and scholar. He conducted a defense of the tradition of Romantic poetry, particularly against the efforts of the new critics. Harold Bloom wrote 3 books on Romantic poetry: Shelley's Myth Making, The Visionary Company, and Blake's Apocalypse. In Blake's Apocalypse, Bloom conducts several readings of Blake's prophetic poetry. In 1967, Bloom wrote a visionary poem, The Covering Cherub or Poetic Influence. The poem is a sort of waking dream that foregrounds poet's quest for romance and revisits Bloom's interpretation of Blake's prophecies. We are going to do Blake in detail soon. So, therefore, it is important to understand that how relevant the Romantics still are. We will be doing American Romanticism soon when we embark on American literature. Blake's Romanticism and Consciousness, a book published in 1970, is a collection of essays including Bloom's own The Internalization of Quest Romance. And then of course, one of his greatest works, The Anxiety of Influence, 1973, where he challenges the accepted notion that literary tradition is a benign and empowering source of influence on modern poets. Instead, Bloom argues, for poets since Milton, the achievements of their great precursors are barriers for their own aspirations to originality. Before I sum up, I would like to quote from Shelley, who said, "The function of the sublime is to persuade us to end the slavery of pleasure. This is what a writer's job is, and that is what he considers important." And those of you who want to know more about the Romantic era, please look at the slides here. There is a reading list for you. M. H. Abrams, The Mirror and the Lamp, Romantic Theory and the Critical Tradition. M. H. Abrams, Natural Supernaturalism. Harold Bloom, The Visionary Company, and Marshall Brown's The Cambridge History of Literary Criticism. Douglas Bush's Mythology and the Romantic Tradition in English Poetry. Marilyn Butler's Romantics, Rebels and Reactionaries, English Literature and its Background. Paul de Man's The Rhetoric of Romanticism. And before I wind up, please look at this video on Coleridge, Imagination and Fancy. Thank you very much. We will continue with English poetry, Romantic poetry in our next class.